Moving on to Mr. Alex Neve, who is a lawyer with an LLB from Dalhousie University and a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Essex. He's presently an adjunct professor of international human rights law with the faculties of law at the University of Ottawa and Dalhousie University. He served as the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada's English branch for 20 years, between 2000 and 2020. In that role, he has led and been part of numerous human rights and research and advocacy delegations throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, Guantanamo Bay, and First Nation communities across Canada. He serves on the board of directors of the Centre for Law and Democracy. Mr. Alex has been named an officer of the Order of Canada and the Trudeau Foundation Mentor. He is the recipient of a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. He has received honorary doctorate of laws degrees from St. Thomas University, the University of Waterloo, and the University of New Brunswick. Professor Neve, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you for the weekend. This is a tremendous initiative. It's always important to have gatherings that bring us together to learn from each other and grapple with the enormous human rights challenges we face in our world. But I'm sure I speak for all of us in saying now more than ever, given the gravity and the heaviness of the human rights landscape out there in our world, be it Gaza, be it the ongoing situation in Ukraine, be it situations like Sudan, which aren't attracting anywhere near enough attention, the timing for us to be together this weekend is tremendous. I'm going to address something very specific. I think there's a lot of issues, a lot of concerns that we need to take account of when we're assessing these questions about atrocities, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Why do they happen? How do we stop them? How do we address them? What stands in the way? And one element that I want to make sure that we have some time to think about is the tension that exists in our world, and we see it all the time. It's very much playing out right now with respect to the situation in Israel-Gaza, is this supposed debate, this supposed trade-off between human rights, which is what brings us together, and security. And the consequences of the debates and the tensions that revolve around that question often mask atrocity crimes, are used to justify atrocity crimes, certainly lay the ground for the circumstances that lead to atrocity crimes. And so I think it's really important for us to take some time to think about it. I'm going to do so with respect to a very particular situation because I've been there recently. As you'll see from the opening slide here, I was part of a delegation that traveled to Northeast Syria about 2 months ago, and we spent time in prisons and detention camps in the region, and this whole issue about security and human rights is at the heart of that. Now, I've framed it here as the debate, not because I think it's a debate. In fact, I reject the notion that it's a debate, but I frame it as that because it's often put to us that it's a debate. Human rights, national security. And it's a debate that really then lays the ground for double standards and pretexts and selectivity, racism and discrimination when it comes to human rights protection, none of which, of course, is good. Some suggest that this is a trade-off. You get one or you get the other. If you want to be more secure in this world, then you've just got to accept the fact that there's going to be less human rights protection. If you're a bleeding heart whose only concern is human rights protection, then you have to accept more insecurity. Zero-sum game. There's only one pie, and we have to divide it up. There's another approach to this which kind of sees them as compatible. You know, we got the security stream, we got the human rights stream, there's people paying attention to both, and that's all good. That the two never really need to meet or take account of each other. I obviously fall within the last category there. I see security and human rights as having a vital, interconnected relationship. You do not have one without the other. And if you do downplay one, it's going to be detrimental to both. And so for me, it's all about security through human rights. Before I take us to the main event and the work we did in Northeast Syria, I want to just give us, and I'm sure this is a room full of people, I don't need to go into details here, but just to remind us, we have been down this road time and time again, and seemingly we are incapable of learning the lessons that need to be learned. Obviously, the most iconic instance, Guantanamo Bay. But here in Canada, we have many chapters now, especially over the last 20 plus years since 9/11, of individuals and broader circumstances, policies, practices, laws that have been all about countenancing human rights violations, supposedly in the name of national security. And over the course of all of this, we've had a lot of accountability. In Canada, we've had 2 judicial inquiries that looked at the first 2 bullets on that list. The Supreme Court of Canada, on 3 separate occasions, has looked at Omar Khadr's case. The recommendations, the lessons, the findings, the conclusions, the remedies have been long ago enumerated and put in front of us. And you like to think, therefore, we've left some of the worst of that behind. And then we come to Northeast Syria. Many of you will likely know the circumstances there. I'm not going to, obviously there's a long story to tell about human rights in Syria, which long predates 2011. But the significant chapter relevant to our mission begins with the rise of ISIS, Daesh, in both Northeast Syria and across the border in northern Iraq. As many of you will know, they came to control a significant chunk of territory, self-declared a caliphate and governed in those areas, and those were horrific years of heinous crimes, acts of unbelievable violence. That's the time of the Yazidi genocide, for instance. They were defeated. They were defeated largely by a Syrian Kurdish force with significant backing from the United States and Western governments. And now, in the colored side, you see so that largely, I guess that's yellow, kind of a yellowy green color, which is Northeast Syria. You can see it is almost all controlled by those forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, backed by the US, but not entirely. There's a chunk of territory right along the border there, for instance, controlled by Turkey, which is a huge source of insecurity for the people of Northeast Syria. And there's ongoing, there's even some elements that are still controlled by Assad's government. Once military control was consolidated, ISIS defeated, a de facto administration known as the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria takes control, and while it's obviously not an independent state, governs in the region with significant Western backing. Ongoing security issues. While defeated, ISIS is not gone, and there are from time to time, including while we were there on the ground, ISIS attacks or rumors of ISIS attacks from sleeper cells and unscattered agents. And then ongoing, very serious security threats from the Turkish military. The week before we were there, through a targeted Turkish drone attack, an independent Kurdish journalist in Syria and her driver were killed. And that kind of thing is in front of people all the time. What we were focused on is the fact that when ISIS was defeated, ANIS, as it's known, found itself with being responsible for around 50,000 foreign nationals who were there, living under ISIS control, and were there for a whole variety of different reasons. Now, the easy narrative, and the one that certain media outlets love to promote, and certain governments are fond of repeating, is to just tar everyone with the same broad accusation. If you were there during those years of ISIS, you're an ISIS supporter, fighter, militant, end of story. Well, it isn't the end of the story. If there's 50,000 foreign nationals, there's probably 5,000 different stories as to why people were there. Yes, some of whom are ISIS fighters and leaders responsible for absolutely horrific, cruel acts. There are ISIS opponents. There are family members. There are Yazidi refugees who had fled from Iraq into Syria. There are women and children who were trafficked into the region. One half, approximately, are Iraqi nationals. And then here's the real kicker, friends. More than one half are children. and young children. The bulk are not like 15, 16, 17. Most of them are under the age of 12. ISIS supporters, militants, fighters, undeserving of our compassion and concern. There's estimated to be about 60 countries, and certainly Canadians are in the mix. Initially, all the foreign nationals were rounded up. Anas and the Syrian Democratic Forces were a bit overwhelmed by this challenge, knew that there's both innocent people and criminals in the mix, had no capacity to sort that out, so everyone was rounded up and housed in 2 large camps that have been refugee camps in the past. They were too overcrowded and there were security concerns, so then a subsequent decision was taken to remove all of the men and teenage boys. As boys turn 15 or so, they're taken out, families separated, and they're now all held in prisons. No charges, no trials, no access to lawyers. There's no kind of process in place of any kind, formal or informal, that you can come in front of someone to challenge the reasons for your continuing detention and seek release. Anas has said to the international community, we need help here. They've said, number one, to countries like Canada, take your people, repatriate your people, deal with the criminality that some of them be responsible for in your own justice systems. They've also made a request for an international tribunal. They know that that's happened from time to time. Is this not an instance, they say, where it might be appropriate to have an international tribunal to try some of the most high-ranking, iconic cases? They've also asked for help to build the justice system locally, recognizing that at the end of the day, there will still be numbers of people who will have to be dealt with locally. So help us build a justice response, training, human resources, technical expertise. International response? Nah. Pretty well entirely disinterest, and none of those requests have been granted. Meanwhile, concerns mount rapidly about conditions in the camps and the prisons. Currently, for instance, there's a massive tuberculosis outbreak raging through the prisons with next to no medication or treatment available. What about Canada in this? Well, it's estimated that there's been over 50 Canadians in the camps and prisons. Again, like the overall camp population, more than half children. Initially, very early on, after ISIS was defeated, we did hear some promising signs from the Canadian government that they got it, that they have some obligations and responsibilities here, and that yes, Canadians would, as is their right, be brought back to Canada and dealt with here. But for about the last 4 or 5 years, that's completely changed, and there's been a real opposition to any notion of repatriation. It's now starting to happen slowly. There was a trickle of returns in 2021, 2022, a more significant number earlier this year, largely in response to a court action that was underway. But we know that there's at least 9 men, held in the prisons, of course, 1 Canadian woman, 13, so again, more than half, 13 Canadian children, and then also 3 non-Canadian women who are mothers to some of those 13 children. But Canada refuses to even show up to check how they're doing, provide consular visits, let alone to move towards repatriation, saying, too dangerous, too far, too difficult, too complicated, we can't do it. They've quite extraordinarily formulated a specific policy on consular assistance that applies to this group and this group alone. So they don't get the regular policy that all Canadians who are looking for and expecting consular assistance may turn to. They have this remarkable document known as the Government of Canada Policy Framework to evaluate the provision of extraordinary assistance consular cases in northeastern Syria, which I won't take you through, but trust me when I say it's essentially a document that goes on for pages and pages to try to lay out the circumstances under which consular assistance won't be provided. It's gone to court. This isn't a law school lecture, so I won't take you through the court case, but it's been through 3 levels of court now. There was an amazing federal court ruling in January which ruled on behalf of the families that had brought the case. And my favorite line in it, which I've highlighted in blue there, was, simply put, there is no known offense in Canada that carries with it exile or banishment as a penal consequence, because that's what's happening here. That was reversed. So the government won the next round at the end of May by the Federal Court of Appeal, which has essentially said that yes, they do have a right to enter the country, but the government has no obligation to do anything to facilitate that. So if they show up at last month, the Supreme Court of Canada refused to hear a further appeal. So that's the end of it legally. So I'm probably past my 15 minutes, am I? Oh, okay, 3 minutes for 20 minutes of my presentation. Okay, I'll go quick here. In the midst of all of this, then, a group of us came together and decided we need to do something that's going to kind of break this open a little bit. So we decided to pull together a civil society delegation to try to travel to Northeast Syria, to get access to as many of the Canadians still detained there, to punch through this argument that we hear from the Canadian government that you can't do it, it's too dangerous, too far, too difficult, but also to reassert this notion that yes, even when there are security challenges, even when we have a country, a region that's reeling from terrible war crimes and crimes against humanity, and when we throw the Yazidi context into this, even genocide, security doesn't trump human rights. And this is the delegation that came together. I've listed us there. I won't take time to do so again, but we were led by a senator. So we had some political credibility. We were there at the end of August. We had originally hoped that we might convince the government to designate us to be their representative in terms of facilitating repatriation, because that had been a possibility that was included in the initial federal court ruling in January. But once that was reversed, that was no longer an option. But it still was clear to us that there was a pressing humanitarian need to be there. Many of the families have not, especially with respect to the male prisoners, have not even had confirmation that they're alive, as basic as that, for as long as 5 years. Just put yourself in that family's context. Some of you may even come from families that have known the agonizing toll of enforced disappearances, because that's what we're talking about. Pictures of some of the meetings, etc. we had. But then most significantly, we went first to the camps, which is where the women and children are held. We weren't allowed to take pictures inside, so this is a picture as we're approaching it. You can see how crowded it is as you look through the fence. We were able to meet all of the women, the one Canadian woman and the 3 non-Canadian women. We met some, but not all of the 13 Canadian children. All sorts of humanitarian concerns, as you can well imagine, ranging from healthcare to living conditions. It was 45 degrees when we were there. Think back to those crowded, tarpaulin covered, very small living conditions. It's agonizing conditions, education issues, etc. But the most galling piece, and we knew this before we arrived, but to hear this from the women, one after another, is that the government has said to them, your children can come back. We will repatriate your children, but not you. Just let that sit with you for a minute. They're even saying that to the Canadian woman. I thought that we'd learned some lessons in this country about rejecting government policies that rip families apart. But that's exactly what we're proposing here. They've been told if you have extended family, we'll make sure that the children are reunited with them. If you don't, we'll take steps to make sure they're taken into foster care, and we'll do that well. And you need to know, the law around foster care is that if you don't show up within 2 years to reassert your parental rights, they'll be put in the permanent adoption stream. Just let that all sit with you for a minute. And then we did get some access. We knew this was going to be hugely difficult. There was 9 men we were trying to get in to see in the prisons. We were only able to see 2, but to a certain degree that was even more than we had thought we would. It was chilling. You'll see I've called this Guantanamo 2.0. I often add an asterisk and say on steroids, because it really is. Guantanamo Bay, we had 780 men. There's still 30 there. We had a handful, like Omar Khadr, who were picked up while they were still teenagers. Northeast Syria, we have 50,000 plus. We have 8,000 in the prisons alone, more than half of whom, as I say, are children. Warehoused, held now for 5-6 years, no end in sight, no charges, no legal process, beyond the reach of the courts, beyond the reach of lawyers. This is Guantanamo 2.0. Then it was Al-Qaeda, now it's ISIS. Okay, so these are the two men we saw. We by necessity had to do the interviews with prison guards present, so we obviously didn't get all sorts of sensitive information. We did get confirmation they're both suffering from serious health problems. We also got confirmation that they are being interrogated extensively by foreign intelligence agencies. Muhammad Ali at the top there told us he's been interrogated by the FBI alone 25 times, including 2 weeks before our visit. So not just that there was an intense period of interrogation at the beginning, it's ongoing. So we wrapped up, we came back, we've been doing as much as we can to get political attention, to engage with the government. We've been having some somewhat encouraging discussions. And then lastly, I'll just leave with you there. This is kind of the roadmap of what we've said needs to happen, which is kind of very specific, urgent, immediate things like get consular officers on the ground to carry out visits with people who are in these dangerous, vulnerable conditions and have had no consular support for 5-6 years, all the way through to foreign policy recommendations at the bottom, such as get active with your NATO ally and press for an end to Turkish military strikes in Northeast Syria, and a whole bunch of other things in between. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alex.